The rain drummed a steady rhythm against my window, each drop a reminder of the endless nights I've spent chasing shadows in this god-forsaken city. There's a certain darkness that clings to the walls here, something you can't wash off no matter how hard you try. It gets under your skin, into your bones, and you carry it with you like an old scar. Deep, hidden, but never quite healed. I was nursing my third cigarette of the evening, watching the smoke curl lazily toward the ceiling, when the phone rang. It was a sound I'd grown to despise, a siren call that never brought good news. But in my line of work, you learn to answer anyway. This time it was different. The voice on the other end was tight, strained. A girl just shy of her 13th birthday found lifeless in the woods of Teo, a Coruña. A place half a world away, but the echoes of her death reached me here, in the cold and rain-soaked streets of my city. Her name was Asunta Basterra, and something about it felt wrong, like a puzzle with too many missing pieces. They said it looked like an accident at first, but I've been in this game long enough to know that some stories are more than just ink on paper. They're written in blood, and this one was no different. A young life snuffed out, and the people who should have protected her were the ones who seemed the most suspicious. I flicked the cigarette into the ashtray and pulled my trench coat from the back of the chair. The night was calling, and I had a feeling this case was going to be one of those that sticks with you, the kind that leaves a mark. Asunta Basterra, a name I wouldn't forget. Not tonight, not ever. Act 1. The Innocence Lost. Asunta Basterra. Even her name sounded delicate, like a whisper in the wind, something you could easily miss if you weren't paying attention. She was born in a far-off place, China, a world away from the cobblestone streets of A Coruña. She was just a baby when the Basterras brought her home. An orphan, alone, until they opened their arms and promised her the world. The Basterras, Rosario and Alfonso, were the kind of couple that seemed to have it all. Rosario, with her refined elegance and a smile that could charm the devil himself. Alfonso, always the picture of quiet strength, a man who wore his suits as if he was born in them. Together, they were the epitome of success, the kind of people you read about in society pages and see at charity galas. They had money, influence, and now, a daughter they claimed to love more than life itself. But life has a way of twisting the things we hold dear, turning them into something unrecognizable, something ugly. It was a Sunday when they found her, the kind of day that should have been spent laughing in the sunshine, not shrouded in the gloom of a police investigation. Her body was discovered in the woods, not far from a dusty old path, lying there as if she had simply fallen asleep and never woken up. She was days away from her 13th birthday, and instead of planning a celebration, they were planning a funeral. The initial whispers were that it could have been an accident. Maybe she wandered off, got lost in the dark, and something terrible happened. The kind of thing that makes your heart sink, but at least you can understand it. But as I looked at the reports and sifted through the photos, a cold knot tightened in my gut. There was something wrong with this picture. Something that didn't add up. They said she had been drugged, lorazepam, enough to put an adult under. But Asunta wasn't an adult. She was just a kid who should have been safe at home, not lying in the damp earth, her life snuffed out before it even began. Accidents happen. But this didn't feel like an accident. This felt like something far worse. Something deliberate. And as I pieced together the fragments of her short life, I couldn't shake the feeling that the Basterras, with their perfect smiles and perfect lives, were hiding something. Something dark. Something that would make the rain feel colder, the nights longer, and the weight of the world even heavier on my shoulders. Act 2. The picture-perfect family. To anyone on the outside looking in, they were the kind of couple you'd envy. They lived in a grand house on a quiet street, the kind where the lawns are always manicured, and the neighbors never miss a thing. Rosario was an attorney, sharp as a tack, with a reputation that preceded her. Alfonso, a journalist, had a way with words that could spin any story into something worth reading. Together, They were a force to be reckoned with, pillars of the community. People like them don't just have money, they have power, the kind that opens doors and closes others. They attended the right events, knew the right people, and their names carried weight. So when they brought Asunta into their lives, no one questioned it. They were giving a child a better life, a chance at something she might never have had otherwise. It was a story with a happy ending, or so everyone thought. When Asunta's death hit the news, the Basterras were the picture of grief. Rosario, usually so composed, was seen in tears, clutching a handkerchief like it was the only thing keeping her from falling apart. Alfonso, with his usual calm demeanor, looked like a man who had just lost everything. They played their roles well, the grieving parents, shattered by the loss of their only child. But as I watched them, I couldn't shake the feeling that something was off. It wasn't anything they said. No. Their words were carefully chosen, just the right mix of sorrow and disbelief. It was what they didn't say that gnawed at me, the way they seemed to be performing their grief rather than living it. I've seen real loss before, and it's messy, raw. This was too clean, too controlled. I started digging into their lives, looking for the cracks beneath the polished surface. What I found was a couple that was far from perfect. Behind closed doors, their relationship was strained, full of secrets and lies that no amount of wealth could cover up. There were whispers of arguments, tension that had been building for years. And then there was the matter of the drugs. The lorazepam that had found its way into Asunta's system wasn't something a child should have had access to. Someone had given it to her, and the more I looked into it, the more it seemed like this wasn't the first time. The Basterras claimed they didn't know how Asunta got her hands on the medication, but their story had too many holes. And as I pieced it all together, I realized that their grief might not be just for the loss of their daughter. It might be for the loss of the life they had carefully constructed, a life that was now unraveling before their eyes. Something wasn't right with this family. They were hiding something, and whatever it was buried deep, beneath layers of respectability and charm. But no matter how deep it was, I was determined to find it. Because in my line of work, the truth has a way of coming to the surface, no matter how much you try to bury it. And the truth about the Basterras was starting to look a lot darker than anyone could have imagined. Act 3. Unraveling the Facade. The deeper I dug, the more the Basterras' perfect life began to crack at the edges. Their story was like a house of cards, delicate, and all it needed was the slightest push to come tumbling down. That push came in the form of inconsistencies, small, almost imperceptible at first, but they were there, hidden in the details if you knew where to look. Rosario and Alfonso each had an alibi for the night Asunta disappeared. Rosario claimed she had been out running errands, a mundane task that should have been easy to verify. Alfonso, on the other hand, said he was home, working late on a piece for the paper. But when I started to piece together their movements, things didn't quite add up. There were gaps, moments where neither could account for their whereabouts. And in those gaps, the suspicion grew. Then there was the matter of the lorazepam. The toxicology report confirmed that Asunta had ingested a lethal dose, far more than any child should have been exposed to. The coroner noted signs of asphyxiation as well, the combination of drugs and suffocation leading to her untimely death. It was a brutal, calculated act, the kind of thing that didn't happen by accident. I started asking the hard questions. When did this start? How long had Asunta been living in this nightmare? The more I learned, the more it became clear that this wasn't a one-time event. The drugs had been in her system before, traces found in earlier medical records. It was a slow poisoning, a methodical erosion of her life, piece by piece. But why? That was the question that kept me up at night, the one that gnawed at me like a dog with a bone. What could drive parents, her own flesh and blood, even if not by birth, to commit such a heinous act? I traced the timeline, following the breadcrumbs left behind in prescription records, school reports, and testimonies from those who knew the family. Asunta had started showing signs of fatigue, dizziness, and other symptoms months before her death. Her teachers noticed the change, but the Basterras brushed it off as growing pains, stress from school. But now, in the cold light of hindsight, it was clear these were the early signs of something much darker. I found myself going over and over the parents' statements, looking for the thread that would unravel it all. Rosario's cool demeanor, Alfonso's quiet stoicism. They were masks, and behind them, I sensed fear, desperation, maybe even guilt. The more they tried to maintain their story, the more it felt rehearsed, practiced. They were trying to convince themselves as much as anyone else. The evidence was stacking up against them, but there was still something missing, a final piece that would tie it all together. Something that would reveal not just the how, but the why. Because in cases like these, the why is often the darkest part of all. As I continued to pull at the threads, the facade they had so carefully constructed began to unravel. The Basterras were not the loving parents they appeared to be. They were something else entirely, and whatever that was, it had driven them to do the unthinkable. The only question now was how far down this dark path they had gone, and whether I could bring their secrets into the light before it was too late. Act 4. The Dark Truth. The evidence was like a weight pressing down, each piece heavier than the last, until it became impossible to ignore the truth. Rosario Porto and Alfonso Basterra were not just suspects, they were the architects of Asunta's demise. The more I uncovered, the more I realized this wasn't just a crime of passion or a spur-of-the-moment mistake. It was cold, calculated, and premeditated. It started with the drugs. Lorazepam, a tranquilizer used to calm nerves, to quiet the mind. But in the wrong hands, it's a weapon. The toxicology reports showed that Asunta had been given this drug over a period of months, her young body gradually overwhelmed by doses far beyond what any child should have been exposed to. It wasn't just a way to keep her quiet, it was a methodical erasure of her will, her ability to fight back. Each pill was another step toward the inevitable end. I pieced together the timeline, tracing the moments when Asunta would have been most vulnerable. Rosario, with her access to prescriptions, had the means. Alfonso, with his quiet demeanor and constant presence at home, had the opportunity. Together they orchestrated a plan so vile it made my blood run cold. The final act came on that fateful night in September. Asunta was given a dose large enough to knock out a grown man, her small body barely able to comprehend what was happening. Then came the asphyxiation, quiet, efficient, leaving no room for struggle. They made sure she wouldn't wake up again. But the question that haunted me was why? What could drive parents to such lengths? To destroy the very life they were supposed to protect? Theories swirled in my mind, each more disturbing than the last. Some whispered it was financial gain, an insurance policy, a way to escape mounting debts. Others suggested it was pressure, the crushing weight of maintaining their perfect image, of hiding cracks that had been growing for years. But as I dug deeper, I couldn't shake the feeling that there was something more, something darker. Perhaps it was a psychological unraveling, a twisted sense of control, or a bond between Rosario and Alfonso that had grown toxic over the years, consuming everything in its path, including their daughter. The trial was a spectacle, the kind that draws crowds and headlines. Rosario and Alfonso, sitting side by side, their faces masks of stoic denial. The prosecution laid out the evidence piece by piece. Every pill, every inconsistency, every lie. The defense tried to paint them as victims of circumstance, claiming the drugs were a mistake, that Asunta had taken them on her own. But the story didn't hold water. The evidence was too strong, the truth too glaring to ignore. Witnesses took the stand, doctors, teachers, friends, each adding another layer to the damning portrait of the Basterras. And then there were the testimonies from experts, detailing the timeline of Asunta's poisoning, the gradual erosion of her health, and the final, fatal night. In the end, the jury didn't take long to reach a verdict. Guilty, of murder, of betrayal, of the worst kind of cruelty. Rosario and Alfonso were sentenced to 18 years in prison, a punishment that seemed almost too lenient for the crime they had committed. But even as the gavel fell, I couldn't shake the feeling that justice, in cases like this, is never truly served. Asunta was gone, her life snuffed out before it had a chance to fully begin, and the people responsible would serve their time. But the darkness they had unleashed, on her, on themselves, would linger, like a shadow that never fades. Rosario Porto would eventually take her own life in prison, a final, desperate act that left more questions than answers. Alfonso would continue to maintain his innocence, a man who had woven his own reality so tightly that perhaps he even believed it himself. But for me, the case was closed. The truth as clear as the rain-soaked streets outside my window. The Basterras weren't the picture-perfect family they pretended to be. They were something far worse, something that, despite all my years on the job, still had the power to chill me to the bone. Act 5. Echoes of the Past. As the years have passed, the shadows of the Asunta Basterra case have only grown longer. Time has a way of dulling the sharp edges of memory, but some wounds never fully heal. This case, this tragedy, is one of them. It lingers in the corners of my mind, a constant reminder of the darkness that can hide behind even the most polished facades. Rosario Porto's suicide in prison was the final chapter in a story that never should have been written. Some saw it as an admission of guilt, others as the last act of a woman whose soul had been consumed by the weight of her own sins. But for me, it only deepened the mystery, adding another layer of questions that will never have answers. What drove her to that final, desperate act? Was it remorse, fear, or simply the crushing realization of what she had done? Or was it something darker, a final attempt to escape the inescapable truth? And what of Alfonso, left behind to live with the ghosts of his past? A man who once had everything, now reduced to a shadow of himself. He continues to proclaim his innocence, but the evidence, the facts, tell a different story. A story of deception, of a life built on lies, and of a daughter who paid the ultimate price. As I sit here, staring out at the rain-soaked streets, I can't help but think about the broader implications of this case. How many more families out there are hiding secrets behind closed doors? How many more lives are quietly unraveling, unseen by the world until it's too late? It's a thought that keeps me up at night, the kind that gnaws at your conscience and makes you question everything you thought you knew. Asunta Basterra was just a child, a girl who should have had a future full of possibilities. Instead, her life was cut short by the very people who were supposed to protect her. It's a tragedy that goes beyond words, a reminder that the line between love and cruelty is thinner than we'd like to believe. In the end, the case of Asunta Basterra isn't just about the crime that was committed. It's about the darkness that can live inside us all, the secrets we keep, and the lengths we'll go to protect the lies we tell ourselves. It's a story that will stay with me long after the rain has stopped and the streets have dried. A story of innocence lost, and of the heavy price we pay for the sins of those we trust the most. As I close my notebook and take one last drag from my cigarette, I can't help but feel the weight of it all. The rain outside is relentless, but it's the echoes of the past that haunt me. Asunta's face, her story, will forever be etched in my mind. And no matter how many cases I take on, how many nights I spend chasing shadows, I know I'll never forget the tragedy of the girl who lost her life to the darkness that lurked behind the walls of a perfect family. Some cases stay with you, like an old scar that never fully heals. This one has carved itself deep, leaving a mark that time will never erase.